Hello and welcome to Written Words. I'm Helen and today I am going to take a look again at some of the work of George Eliot. In an earlier video I recorded the beginning of my George Eliot journey when I'd been for a visit to Nuneaton and Coventry and learned a lot about George Eliot and her writing. So this video is my next step on that journey because I've been reading this book. I've been reading her novel The Mill on the Floss. So I have two copies of the book. This is the copy that I read, it's my book, but unfortunately this one doesn't have any notes in it. So I also have a copy that I borrowed from the library which has some explanatory notes at the back as well. And the reason why I started with The Mill on the Floss is because The Mill on the Floss is set in the fictional town of St. Ogg's, and the Floss is the river which flows through it. And the Floss and St. Ogg's were inspired by the town of Gainsborough and its river, the Trent, which is my hometown. So I was interested to read the book to see how much of Gainsborough I could recognise. But of course, it being such a great work of literature, I also found so much more along the way as well. So what is actually known about George Eliot's relationship with the town of Gainsborough? George Eliot, for those who might not know, is the pen name of Mary Ann Evans. So George Eliot was actually a woman writing in the mid-19th century. We do know that George Eliot visited Gainsborough at least once, and there is a commemorative plaque on the building where she stayed when she came. It's on Bridge Street, very near the bridge which goes over the River Trent. She came because she needed a town that had a tidal river that was prone to flooding. Because if you've read the story, you will know that the river and the flooding and the tide are key to the story. So she would have come presumably to do some research, to take a look at the river and do some research on the town and the river. There are also rumours that she visited the town more than once, and she also stayed in the village of Morton, which is just on the northern outskirts of the town. But there seems to be some dispute over whether she came and where she stayed if she did. So in this video, I wanted to take a look at some of the locations in the book and their corresponding locations in Gainsborough and compare the two and see how much of Gainsborough we can actually find in The Mill on the Floss. The opening paragraph of the book does indeed describe a location that is very similar to Gainsborough. Anybody who knows the town may very well recognise some of the features she describes. A wide plain, where the broadening Floss hurries on between its green banks to the sea, and the loving tide rushing to meet it checks its passage with an impetuous embrace. On this mighty tide the black ships, laden with the fresh-scented fir planks, with rounded sacks of oil-bearing seed, or with the dark glitter of coal, are borne along to the town of St. Ogg's, which shows its aged, fluted red roofs and the broad gables of its wharves between the low wooded hill and the river brink, tinging the water with a soft purple hue under the transient glance of this February sun. Far away, on each hand, stretch the rich pastures and the patches of dark earth made ready for the seed of broad-leaved green crops, or touched already with the tint of the tender-bladed autumn-sown corn. There is a remnant still of the last year's golden clusters of beehive ricks rising at intervals beyond the hedgerows, and everywhere the hedgerows are studded with trees. The distant ships seem to be lifting their masts and stretching their red-brown sails close among the branches of the spreading ash. Just by the red-roofed town, the tributary Ripple flows with a lively current into the Floss. How lovely the little river is with its dark, changing wavelets. It seems to me like a living companion, while I wander along the bank and listen to its low, placid voice, as to the voice of one who is deaf and loving. I remember those large dipping willows. I remember the stone bridge. It's a lovely idyllic picture of a sleepy, dreamy provincial town surrounded by agricultural land. And Gainsborough is indeed, to this day, surrounded by agricultural land. It's a town all on its own, surrounded by fields. And along the banks of the Trent, there are indeed lots of willow trees. And then there is, of course, the tide. The Trent is a tidal river, and twice a day the flow of the water changes direction as the tide comes in and out at sea. But as I read that description, it very much called to mind another passage from another book, which is quite similar in nature. And that book is Our Old Town by Thomas Miller. The Mill on the Floss was first published in 1860, and Our Old Town was published 3 years before that, in 1857. And the author, Thomas Miller, came from Gainsborough, and his book Our Old Town is describing life in Gainsborough in the early part of the 19th century. So let's just compare the opening section of Our Old Town. Our old town is a strange, rambling, twisting, dreamy-looking place. Portions of it are very ancient, and the principal streets are built in the form of a cross, a sure sign of great antiquity. A beautiful navigable river flows beside it, and runs for miles through a rich pastoral country, then empties itself into an arm of the sea. Behind, it is hemmed in by green, breezy hills, looking as if, undated centuries ago, its first inhabitants had erected their huts at the foot of the hills for shelter, while they pastured their flocks in the valley. Beyond the town, along the river banks, the black bulrush still nods beside the water flag, while the tufted plover goes wailing over the hedgeless marshes, giving to the landscape in many places the same primitive features it wore when the river was mastless, before the blue smoke that pointed out the dwelling of man had curled above the overhanging foliage. So there are some interesting similarities between those two opening paragraphs that did make me wonder whether George Eliot had actually read Miller's book, which is quite possible. Another important feature of the Floss and, of course, the Trent is the tidal bore. On the River Trent, twice a day, the flow of the river changes direction because of the movement of the tide out at sea. But sometimes, if you're lucky, usually in spring or the autumn, there is a more spectacular tidal bore which comes up from time to time, and that is known as the Eiger. There are several different spellings that have been used for the Eiger over time, and the name harks back to the time of the Vikings who did settle in the town, having arrived from the sea and come down the river. The Eiger is named after the Norse god of the sea. Another 19th century writer who came from the town, Thomas Cooper, described the Eiger in his autobiography. The Eiger was our great excitement on the Trent. It used to be a very stirring sight when the tide was at the full. The huge rolling waves then dashed the shipping from their moorings if they were not well moored and managed, and boats were often crushed to pieces. So you can see from Cooper's description that the Eiger was something quite spectacular, not to mention powerful and a force to be reckoned with. And of course, George Eliot mentions the Eiger in The Mill on the Floss. In chapter 3, she says, "Above all, the great Floss, along which they wandered with a sense of travel, to see the rushing spring tide, the awful Eiger come up like a hungry monster." So by calling it a hungry monster, she is suggesting that it is most certainly a force to be reckoned with. Leaving aside the river for a moment, let's move to the actual town of St. Ogg's. And this is described in quite some detail in Book 1, Chapter 12, Mr. and Mrs. Glegg at home, because Maggie's aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Glegg, live in St. Ogg's, and it's thought that the building which was their house was modelled on the United Services Club as it is now, which was the building where George Eliot stayed when she visited the town. And this quite detailed description does contain many elements that would be recognisable to someone who knows the town of Gainsborough. In order to see Mr. and Mrs. Glegg at home, we must enter the town of St. Ogg's, that venerable town with the red fluted roofs and the broad warehouse gables, where the black ships unlade themselves of their burthens from the far north, and carry away in exchange the precious inland products, the well-crushed cheese and the soft fleeces, which my refined readers have doubtless become acquainted with through the medium of the best classic pastorals. It is one of those old towns which impress one as a continuation and outgrowth of nature, as much as the nests of the bowerbirds or the winding galleries of the white ants. A town which carries the traces of its long growth and history like a millennial tree, and has sprung up and developed in the same spot between the river and the low hill from the time when the Roman legions turned their backs on it, from the camp on the hillside, and the long-haired sea kings came up the river and looked with fierce, eager eyes at the fatness of the land. It is a town familiar with forgotten years. The shadow of the Saxon hero king still walks there fitfully, reviewing the scenes of his youth and love-time, and is met by the gloomier shadow of the dreadful heathen Dane, who was stabbed in the midst of his warriors by the sword of an invisible avenger, and who rises on autumn evenings like a white mist from his tumulus on the hill, and hovers in the court of the old hall by the riverside, the spot where he was thus miraculously slain in the days before the old hall was built. There are quite a few recognisable features there. First of all, the red fluted roofs and the broad warehouse gables, where the black ships unlaid themselves of their burthens. The town of Gainsborough was a major shipping hub in the 19th century, and the river would have been very busy with ships coming and going and being loaded and unloaded at the wharves at the side of the river in the town. Ships would come from overseas, they would come down the River Humber and then down the Trent into Gainsborough, carrying cargo from all around the world, but in particular from Northern Europe. She mentions cheese as well, and it is also known that Gainsborough was one of the most important importers of cheese in the 19th century too. She mentions it's a very old town and then goes into its history. She mentions the Roman legions who had a camp on the top of the hill, and Thonnock Hill just above the town was indeed the site of a Roman encampment. She mentions the Saxon hero king, which is presumably King Alfred, who had connections with the town, as well as also the dreadful heathen Dane. The dreadful heathen Dane would have been King Sweyn Forkbeard, the Danish king who arrived with his Viking longships and who was proclaimed king while he was in the town. He stayed for a whole 5 weeks before he was mysteriously killed at the castle which is now the site of the old hall. And she goes on to mention the old hall, which we'll come back to in a moment, because there is a scene in The Mill on the Floss which features the old hall. George Eliot also makes reference to the Civil War. Gainsborough was an important location during the Civil War because it was the site of a clash between the Royalist army and Cromwell's troops. But the town knew worse troubles even than the floods, troubles of the civil wars, when it was a continual fighting place, where first Puritans thanked God for the blood of Loyalists, and then Loyalists thanked God for the blood of the Puritans. Many honest citizens lost all their possessions for conscience' sake in those times, and went forth beggared from their native town. There is also a brief mention of John Wesley, preaching in the marketplace. John Wesley, the very well-known Methodist preacher, probably preached all around the country. However, he did come from the small town of Epworth, which is only a dozen or so miles away from Gainsborough. So he would have been a familiar face in the town at one point. One aged person remembered how a rude multitude had been swayed when John Wesley preached in the cattle market. But for a long while it had not been expected of preachers that they should shake the souls of men. George Eliot does go on to discuss religion in quite some detail after that. In the mill on the Floss, the parish church is dedicated to St. Og. However, the parish church in Gainsborough is dedicated to All Saints. George Eliot goes into quite some detail about the legend of St. Og. And although Gainsborough Parish Church is not dedicated to St. Og's, his connection with the floods is highly relevant to Gainsborough, as the town has suffered from many catastrophic floods in the past. And St. Og's function as a ferryman also recalls the time before the bridge was built over the River Trent, when there was a ferry that transported people from one side of the river to the other. So let's take a little look at the legend of St. Og according to George Eliot. Og, the son of Beorl, says my private hagiographer, was a boatman who gained a scanty living by ferrying passengers across the river Floss. And it came to pass one evening when the winds were high, that there sat moaning by the brink of the river a woman with a child in her arms, and she was clad in rags, and had a worn and withered look, and she craved to be rowed across the river. And the men thereabout questioned her, and said, Wherefore dost thou desire to cross the river? Tarry till the morning, and take shelter here for the night, so shalt thou be wise and not foolish. Still she went on to mourn and crave, but Og the son of Beorl came up and said, I will ferry thee across. It is enough that thy heart needs it. And he ferried her across, and it came to pass, when she stepped ashore, that her rags were turned into robes of flowing white, and her face became bright with exceeding beauty, and there was a glory around it, so that she shed a light on the water like the moon in its brightness. And she said, Og, the son of Beorl, thou art blessed in that thou didst not question and wrangle with the heart's need, but wast smitten with pity, and didst straightway relieve the same. And from henceforth whoso steps into thy boat shall be in no peril from the storm, and whenever it puts forth to the rescue, it shall save the lives both of men and beasts. And when the floods came, many were saved by reason of that blessing on the boat. But when Og the son of Beorl died, behold, in the parting of his soul, the boat loosed itself from its moorings, and was floated with the ebbing tide in great swiftness to the ocean, and was seen no more. Yet it was witnessed in the floods of aftertime, that at the coming on of even, Og the son of Beorl was always seen with his boat upon the wide-spreading waters, and the Blessed Virgin sat in the prow, shedding a light around, as of the moon in its brightness, so that the rowers in the gathering darkness took heart and pulled anew. This legend, one sees, reflects from a far-off time the visitation of the floods, which, even when they left human life untouched, were widely fatal to the helpless cattle, and swept as sudden death over all smaller living things. Floods are a very key feature in the history of the town of Gainsborough, and it's interesting to compare George Eliot's description there with Miller's description from our old town. In the winter the fields and marshes for miles around were flooded, and the cattle drowned unless collected beforehand on the hills and higher grounds, and sometimes the high spring tides would rise and overflow its ancient streets, and boats be seen rowing from door to door, and little entries would be dammed up with boards and warp, for such the soil of the river shore was called, and which the sun baked up into hard clay. Then the good-natured sailors might be seen rowing their boats in the streets, and ferrying milkmen, butchers, bakers, publicans, and other tradesmen from house to house. while the inhabitants had to take in their supplies of milk, meat, bread, beer, and other necessaries at the windows, which greatly delighted the children, who thrust out their heads as far as they were permitted to look up and down the river-like streets. But these floods made dreadful havoc of both houses and goods, spoiling almost everything in the cellars and on the ground floors, and throwing, for months after the waters had subsided, melancholy gloom over our old town. Mad bulls would break out of fields and run bellowing through its streets, and wild horses would run away with their riders, and vessels would break from their moorings and be carried away headlong by the strong tides, and dashed against the bridge, where their masts would snap like carrots as they lay foul of one another. So again, there are some similarities in the tone of those two descriptions, and Eliot's description of the story of St. Og is quite prophetic when you know what is to come in the story. Towards the end of the book, she describes a flood. In the counties higher up the Floss, the rains had been continuous, and the completion of the harvest had been arrested. And now, for the last 2 days, the rains on this lower course of the river had been incessant, so that the old men had shaken their heads and talked of 60 years ago, when the same sort of weather, happening about the equinox, brought on the great floods, which swept the bridge away and reduced the town to great misery. But the younger generation, who had seen several small floods, thought lightly of these sombre recollections and forebodings, and Bob Jakin, naturally prone to take a hopeful view of his own luck, laughed at his mother when she regretted their having taken a house by the riverside, observing that but for that they would have had no boats, which were the most lucky of possessions in case of a flood that obliged them to go to a distance for food. So, as has often been the case in the history of humanity, the younger generations do not always pay heed to the experience of the older generations. But as we learn shortly afterwards in the story, the younger generation soon learn their lesson. I mentioned briefly the old hall in Gainsborough, which is still standing today and is a beautiful building and well worth a visit if you're ever in the town. And there is a scene in The Mill on the Floss which takes place inside the old hall, in the great hall, where Maggie is attending a bazaar. All well-dressed St. Og's and its neighbourhood were there, and it would have been worthwhile to come, even from a distance, to see the fine old hall with its open roof and carved oaken rafters and great oaken folding doors, and light shed down from a height on the many-coloured show beneath. A very quaint place, with broad faded stripes painted on the walls, and here and there a show of heraldic animals of a bristly, long-snouted character, the cherished emblems of a noble family once the seigneurs of this now civic hall. A grand arch, cut in the upper wall at one end, surmounted an oaken orchestra with an open room behind it, where hothouse plants and stalls for refreshment were disposed, an agreeable resort for gentlemen disposed to loiter, and yet to exchange the occasional crush down below for a more commodious point of view. In fact, the perfect fitness of this ancient building for an admirable modern purpose, that made charity truly elegant, and led through vanity up to the supply of a deficit, was so striking that hardly a person entered the room without exchanging the remark more than once. Near the great arch over the orchestra was the stone oriel with painted glass, which was one of the most venerable inconsistencies of the old hall, and it was close by this that Lucy had her stall, for the convenience of certain large plain articles which she had taken charge of for Mrs. Ken. So the great hall in the old hall still resembles that description today. I was in there just before Christmas for a Christmas fair, which very much resembled this bazaar that Maggie is attending. It also mentions a show of heraldic animals of a bristly, long-snouted character, and that is presumably referring to the depiction of the boar on the coat of arms of the Bacon family, who inherited the hall in the early 19th century. Stephen Guest is a key, if not pivotal, character in the story of the Mill on the Floss. And his home is Park House. And there is a scene which takes place in Park House when Maggie attends a ball there. It is thought among the people of Gainsborough that Park Hall was modelled on Thonnock Hall, because we're told towards the end of the story that Park House stands high up out of the flood, so it must have been on a hill, and Thonnock Hall did indeed stand on a hill above Gainsborough. The building of Thonnock Hall is no longer there, but the lodge house remains, and in place of the hall now is the clubhouse of Thonnock Park Golf Club. So here is the setting of Park House in the Mill on the Floss. The suite of rooms opening into each other at Park House looked duly brilliant with lights and flowers, and the personal splendours of 16 couples with attendant parents and guardians. The focus of brilliancy was the long drawing room, where the dancing went forward under the inspiration of the grand piano. The library, into which it opened at one end, had the more sober illumination of maturity, with caps and cards, and at the other end the pretty sitting room, with a conservatory attached, was left as an occasional cool retreat. Lucy, who had laid aside her black for the first time, and had her pretty slimness set off by an abundant dress of white crepe, was the acknowledged queen of the occasion, for this was one of the Miss Guest's thoroughly condescending parties, including no member of any aristocracy higher than that of St. Ogg's, and stretching to the extreme limits of commercial and professional gentility. So Park House does seem to have been a very posh place indeed. However, as I was reading the story, I had a different house in my mind. I found myself imagining this scene taking place at the house which does still stand and is not very far away from Thonnock Park, and that is the house in Richmond Park in the town. There are some other local place names that have been equated with places in the book, with varying degrees of tenuousness, so let's take a look at a few of them. The village of Tofton features quite a lot in the book, and it's generally accepted to be based on Morton, which is a small village on the northern outskirts of Gainsborough. There are rumours that Eliot also stayed here at some point, possibly at a house called Willow Bank, or maybe at Morton Hall, which has now been renamed Eliot House. There are certainly lots of reminders of George Eliot and her book if you visit present-day Morton. Tofton is certainly downstream of St. Ogg's, just as Morton is from Gainsborough, so it would correspond geographically. George Eliot tells us, "The boat was soon in the current of the river again, and soon they would be at Tofton." And then on another occasion she says, "The tide will suit for us to the Tofton way, and we can walk back." Morton is indeed within walking distance from the centre of Gainsborough. Another place is Lindham. When Lucy goes on a shopping trip to Lindham, this is a very thinly veiled reference to the city of Lincoln. Lindham was the Roman name for Lincoln, and it's well known to local residents. And Lincoln is about half an hour's drive from Gainsborough. Then we have Mudport. Mudport is at the farthest reaches of the River Floss, near its meeting with the sea. So this would suggest that it corresponds to Hull, which remains an important port to this day. In the mid-19th century, there would have been regular passenger services along the Trent through Gainsborough and on to Hull, where passengers could change for services further north to Newcastle or south to London. Mudport particularly features when Maggie goes on a rather dubious boat ride with Stephen Guest. Presently, Stephen observed a vessel coming after them. Several vessels, among them the steamer to Mudport, had passed them with the early tide, but for the last hour they had seen none. He looked more and more eagerly at this vessel, as if a new thought had come into his mind along with it, and then he looked at Maggie hesitatingly. "Maggie, dearest," he said at last, "if this vessel should be going to Mudport, or to any convenient place on the coast northward, it would be our best plan to get them to take us on board." Then there is the question of the Ripple. Despite the book's title, The Mill on the Floss, the mill, which is called Dorlcote Mill in the story, is actually not on the Floss. It's on the Ripple, which is a tributary of the Floss, just outside St Ogg's. So did Eliot have a particular river in mind when she was thinking of the Ripple? Some say the Ripple is modelled on the River Idle, which does flow into the Trent, albeit several miles north of Gainsborough. Looking at the map, however, there are a couple of becks, including Sawnby Beck, which might be a more likely candidate. But would a small beck like that be big enough to power a watermill? And then, of course, the biggest question of all is, which was the mill that inspired Dorlcote? Which was the original mill on the Floss? There have been several mills on the banks of the River Trent, although none of them are still standing today. There are, however, still plenty of clues that serve as reminders of their existence, and there are plenty of arguments to support each of their cases as the original mill on the Floss. Just below the bridge, at the south of the town, was Ashcroft Mill. This might be the best candidate in terms of location, as it would have been visible from the bridge. And George Eliot tells us that Dorlcote Mill was visible from the bridge. And this is Dorlcote Mill. I must stand a minute or two here on the bridge and look at it, though the clouds are threatening, and it is far on in the afternoon. Then there was Baltic Mill, and this is now remembered with a memorial garden. And as the name suggests, it was the destination for shiploads of linseed, which was brought from the Baltic. And George Eliot does reference rounded sacks of oil-bearing seed in her opening paragraph of the book. She also says, "Russia was the only place where the linseed came from, the more the better, making grist for the great vertical millstones with their scythe-like arms, roaring and grinding and carefully sweeping as if an informing soul were in them." There was a Fletcher's mill in the town too, which was reputedly known by locals as the Mill on the Floss. A millstone from Mercer's Mill is on display on the Riverside Walk in the town. Could this have inspired what George Eliot describes as the resolute din, the unresting motion of the great stones, giving her a dim, delicious awe as at the presence of an uncontrollable force, the meal forever pouring, pouring, the fine white powder softening all surfaces, and making the very spider nets look like a fairy lacework, the sweet, pure scent of the meal, all helped to make Maggie feel that the mill was a little world apart from her outside everyday life. And up at Morton there was also Fretwell's Mill, and this is now the location of a row of modern houses overlooking the river. But the road leading up to them has been named Floss Mill Lane. So those are a few of the little connections with the town of Gainsborough and its river, the Trent, in the Mill on the Floss. Many of them are indeed recognisable, and we do know that George Eliot did come to Gainsborough when she was researching her book. However, we must also bear in mind that this is a work of fiction. There is also a large autobiographical element in the story, in particular with regard to the relationship between brother and sister as George Eliot or Mary Ann Evans was drawing on her experience of growing up with her own brother Isaac. So she has drawn a lot on her personal experience of growing up in the West Midlands, in the area around Nuneaton and Coventry. There are a number of themes in the book which really are more important than its geographical location in real life. Probably most important of all is her exploration of the role of women in society. She also explores the nature of religion and the portrayal of provincial towns and people, and their attitudes to life. The location itself is merely a backdrop against which everything else is played out. So this is a work of fiction. There is no definitive mill on the Floss in the real world, as it's a composite of many things, as any fiction writer will, I'm sure, agree. Places and people provide inspiration, but the fictional characters and places are often a composite of many things. Things from real life and also from the author's imagination. So there are, of course, plenty of recognisable elements that will be familiar to people who know Gainsborough. And indeed, there may be some elements that readers from Warwickshire may spot too. But of course, the real world elements are also mixed up with a hearty serving of imagination and artistic licence as well. So that's my little exploration and my little search for the real mill on the Floss. I hope you enjoyed coming along with me for the ride. If you haven't read The Mill on the Floss, it is certainly a brilliant read, whether or not you're familiar with the town of Gainsborough, and I do highly recommend it. But do make sure you have a box of tissues to hand when you're nearing the end. I will, I'm sure, be returning to George Eliot in the future, as I still have several of her books on my shelf waiting to be read. In the meantime, my next video will be another language video. I'm trying to alternate between videos about language and videos about literature. So my next one will be a language video looking at some of the quirks of the English language. And I've also been doing a lot of reading recently, so there are quite a few book reviews heading to my Facebook page and my blog. If you're interested, keep an eye out for those too. So thank you very much for joining me in this video. I look forward to seeing you in the next one, and in the meantime, happy reading and happy writing.